My name is Dyan Mazurana. I'm the Research Director at the Feinstein International Center and an Associate Research Professor at the Fletcher School of International Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. I'm also the head of the Uganda team for the SLRC Research Consortium. And we've just finished our first of two surveys for our panel survey, which is representative of 3.63 million people in the Acholi and Laung subregions of northern Uganda, which is the most affected area by the war between the LRA, the Lord's Resistance Army, and the government of Uganda. I've been conducting research in northern Uganda for 13 years, and I've got a great team that works with me. Teddy Atim, who's also been working there as long as I have for 13 years, who's from the north, and a great group named INET, which works a lot with war victims, and a group WordET, who works a lot on sexual and gender-based violence. And together, we've just finished the analysis of our first round of research, and we have some really interesting and exciting results. The first is that the thing that seems to drive recovery of a household being able to kind of pull themselves up, be out of poverty, have good levels of wealth, of assets, good food security, they can access their kids, go to a good school, or they're really satisfied with the school, they can get health care. What really seems to drive that, our analysis shows, is what kind of job, what kind of livelihood the head of your household has, and the education levels. And what we find, though, is unfortunately only a very few in northern Uganda have what it takes to kind of rise to the top. And what we're seeing, in fact, is that it's primarily about 3% of that population that's doing well is government employees. The next 1% owns their own private businesses, and the other 4% are people who primarily live from livestock. But the majority of people, over 80%, who participate in their own agricultural production, they're actually at the very bottom. The second thing we found that really matters is your education level. And what we've actually seen is that it needs to be at the A level or above. So that's actually post-secondary school. And very few of the population in northern Uganda have this. And in fact, it's really important for female-headed households. It's only really when we see women in that position that they're able to pull their households out of poverty. But it's actually quite discouraging what we're seeing. If you look at the current levels of 2013 of even enrollment for all of northern Uganda, it's a population of 3.6 million people. There's only about 1,100 students enrolled in A level, and only a quarter of those are girls. So actually what we're seeing is that the kind of occupation that you need and the levels of education you need, it simply isn't there for the vast majority of people in northern Uganda. The third finding, which to me is the most interesting, and I think probably will be the most important finding that we have, is how important it is if a household has experienced what's called a serious crime. And these are serious crimes under international law, but also under Uganda's law. This includes having your member of your household killed by a party to the conflict, deliberate and indiscriminate attacks, being a survivor of a massacre, being set on fire, rape, sexual violence, enforced disappearance, and the looting and pillaging of property. We hypothesize, because we've been working there for so long, that these households are really doing worse. And the fact of the matter is, our data now shows conclusively that they are. So they have the lowest level of wealth, assets, food security, access to health, access to education. These households are at the absolute bottom. The other thing that we have found is we've been actually able to generate the first, I think, solid figures on the number of people who were violently killed during the conflict in northern Uganda, and the number of people who have disappeared and have never returned. For each of those numbers, it's about 100,000 people. So 14% of households in northern Uganda have had someone violently killed by a party to the conflict, and 13% have had a family member disappeared and never returned. In 2 years, when we go back to do the second part of the panel survey, I actually unfortunately think the situation will be worse for these households. We have not seen in the data that the kinds of services, livelihoods, or social protection are actually reaching these kinds of households. With the kind of cuts that we're seeing, with the focus on modernization of agriculture, on people who can do, the kind of viable populations will get access to funds, we actually expect that the majority of our households will be in worse shape. I think to move away from this trend, which I think is what we're going to see happen, we're going to need to see a real wholesale effort by the government and by donors to start looking at the impact of the conflict on these kinds of households and what's needed to help turn things around. It will not be enough to think that general economic recovery to the area by some people is going to pull the rest of the population along. We don't see any evidence that that's occurring.